From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. What's up with you today, David?
Good morning. We have a great show. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, and we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is a unique show because where else can we interview the head of Patriotic Millionaires?
Exactly. This is the show where you hear voices and we explore ideas not found on most other shows. Today is no exception. On the program today, we are going to talk to a quote-unquote traitor to his class, Morris Pearl, who gathered together a bunch of other traitors and chairs an organization called Patriotic Millionaires, which is a group of wealthy Americans who, among other things, are actually willing to pay higher taxes to address issues of both economic and political inequality. We're also going to talk to one of Ralph's old compatriots in the fight for consumer rights, a man who was instrumental in the fight against big tobacco, as well as being the head of the Federal Trade Commission under Jimmy Carter. That's Michael Pertschuk, who has written a new book entitled When the Senate Worked for Us, The Invisible Role of Staff When Countering Corporate Lobbies. We will, as always, check in on the latest tomfoolery going on in the world of big business with our corporate crime reporter, Russ Mokhiber. And at the end of the show, Ralph is going to weigh in on the controversy going on between the NFL and the President of the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about Puerto Rico, too. But first, just as the president is about to unveil his so-called tax reform plan, let's meet a wealthy person who thinks people with his economic status should pay more in taxes. David?
Morris Pearl serves as chair of the Patriotic Millionaires, a group of hundreds of high net worth Americans that focuses on promoting public policy solutions that encourage political equality, guarantees a sustaining wage for working Americans, and ensure that millionaires, billionaires, and corporations pay their fair share of taxes. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Morris Pearl.
Thank you very much. Great to be on your show.
Indeed, welcome. Before we get to how in the world this organization got underway, the history of it, I want to tell our listeners that the philosophical framework of Patriotic Millionaires is based on three themes. One is, and I'm quoting, every American deserves as much political power as millionaires. Number two, every American who works full-time should be able to afford their basic needs. And number three, millionaires and large corporations who benefited most from our country's assets should pay a larger percentage of the tab for running the country. And these are called simple, essential, revolutionary principles. Well, with that background, I think the first curious question would be, how in the world did this group get underway? When and by who?
Sure, I'll tell you, Mr. Nader. We started in 2010 in order to try to get the then President Obama to let the Bush tax cuts expire just for the very wealthiest. He kind of thought we were dorks for attacking from the left, or at least that's what Ms. Jarrett said he thought. But after a couple of months, they realized we were actually helping them. We were actually giving them the political space they needed in order to do what they really wanted to do. So he actually invited us to stand with him on the podium when he gave his famous Buffett Rules speech on April 15th the following year. And he had a bunch of the Patriotic Millionaires standing with their assistants, pointing out it's just unfair that these very wealthy business people and investors are paying lower tax rates than their assistants are. And we think that it's necessary to help everyone else in order to help us. We don't want to live in a country with lots and lots of poor people and a few rich people, because that's not the kind of country we can invest and build businesses and make money. We need a country with lots of people who are doing well enough to be able to afford to buy stuff and shop. And so we don't think we're traitors at all. We think we're looking out for what's right for America.
Well, you're reflecting the historical evidence that the stronger a society is democratically, the more prosperous its economy. I mean, it just makes common sense, but the U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't seem to understand that. I use the analogy that Brazil and the U.S. were colonized about the same time, hundreds of years ago. They're about the same size. They both have very rich natural resources. But Brazil never had a small farmer economy. It was run for most of its history by dictators, monarchies, and oligarchs. And before it made its surge in the last few years, and now it's in trouble again economically, I figured out that the GDP of San Francisco and California, all the way down through Los Angeles to the Mexican border, was greater than the GDP of Brazil, which had 155 million people at the time. So democracies are good for business. Stronger democracies are even better because they facilitate consumer demand. They pay people living wage. They allow innovation, entrepreneurs. They try to restrain monopoly. So that's the background. Tell us, who are some of these millionaires and multimillionaires? Can you give us some of their names and tell us how many of these millionaires belong to your organization?
We have a few hundred who belong to our organization. I'm the chairman, and we have people who are like people from Google, people who made money as investors in the real estate business, people who are lawyers. Stephen Prince was the firm that manufactures those little gift cards that you buy in businesses. He physically makes the plastic cards. We have Lawrence Benenson, who's a real estate investor from New York City, Dan Berger, a Philadelphia lawyer, Chuck Collins, who's the heir to the Oscar Mayer Wiener fortune.
We had Chuck on the program a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
With his new book. You have Steve Silverstein, too, the philanthropist.
Yeah, we have Steve Silverstein. We have Jerry Fidler, the venture capitalist. Phil Edmondson, who founded William G. Gallagher, the insurance company. Ellen Gelson, the heir to the California supermarkets chain, Gelson's. Quite a few people. I mean, I can't remember everyone off the top of my head, but
you have Molly Munger, who's the daughter of the partner Munger with Warren Buffett.
Yes. Yep.
She's out in California. Some of these people are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they still adhere to these principles. You're going to be an organization in the middle of this upcoming struggle in Congress on Trump's so-called tax reform, which we're
going to try to be, certainly.
Yeah, which he unveiled in Indiana, and expects to have a $5.5 trillion 10-year tax cut, with half of it made up by getting rid of some of the loopholes and deductions. That still leaves a huge hole in the deficit and a huge hole in spending tax money for public works and for the general interest of the American people.
Yeah, I mean,
are you going to demand to testify? And how are you going to get involved in this? Because this is going to be one of the page one issues in the coming weeks.
Well, I don't know if the Republicans are going to want to get involved with me too much, but we do get meetings. With Patriotic Millionaire on my business card, a lot of people will give me an appointment. But what we're going to do is we're going to point out, and our members are going to point out, this is a huge savings for the very wealthiest among us. We're going to point out that he wants to have people who don't even work but inherit money, people like Paris Hilton and people like his daughters, pay no taxes at all ever on the money they inherit. We want to point out that people who are very wealthy and have lots of deductions should have even lower tax rates than they do now, by getting rid of the AMT, which was one of the few things that helped make sure that even the craftiest people among us pay some taxes.
That's the alternative minimum tax,
alternative minimum tax, yes, sir. And we want to point out that they are getting rid of deductions that a lot of us take advantage of, like for state and local income taxes, but keeping things that only the wealthiest take advantage of, like tax-free interest on municipal bonds. So we're going to point out that this is making things more unfair and making inequality grow by making the very wealthiest even wealthier. The billionaires will make billions more by never paying taxes on their fortunes. Think of somebody like the Walton heirs from Sam Walton. Sam Walton built that business from nothing to being worth hundreds of billion, over $100 billion when he died.
That's Walmart.
His heirs, Walmart. His heirs inherited that, never paid taxes on the increase in value from zero to what it was at the time that he died, and never will, because they have a basis of the amount the business was worth on the day that he died. Under the new rules, people in that type of situation will never pay estate taxes either. So they're saying basically that people who inherit huge businesses from their parents or grandparents, whatever, will never pay taxes. I just don't think that's right. I don't think it's right that we're going to have a kind of society where we have a few families that get richer and richer and richer and richer, while the rest of the people just kind of try to muddle through, and they're the ones who pay all the taxes.
Let's see what your strategy is going to be. I assume you're going to be invited to testify. I mean, the Democrats have some role in who gets to testify for the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. And I don't think that the Republicans are going to try to ram this one to the floor of the House and Senate without hearings. Even some Republicans are calling for what they call regular order, namely going through the committees. But Patriotic Millionaires have been known to demonstrate outside. Do you plan to demonstrate in Washington and maybe in front of the New York Stock Exchange or some highly visible locale?
I'm thinking that's a lot more likely than being called to testify by Chairman Brady. I mean, we are in touch with Richie Neal, the House Ways and Means ranking member, and with Ron Wyden, the ranking member of the Finance Committee. But they have very few opportunities to invite people to the hearings, the official hearings even. One of the things we did, for instance, our members in Utah all went to Orrin Hatch's office. He's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And they went just to deliver a letter explaining our point of view. And that's the kind of thing that's covered on television news and in newspapers. So it's using our members because, you obviously think that this makes perfect sense. But when we go on something like Fox News, I'm either introduced as a deranged person with some crazy ideas, or if this is headline news that no one's ever thought of before, the idea that, gross inequality is bad for our society. So that's the kind of thing that we try to do.
Are you going to encourage your members, wherever they are in the country, to write op-ed pieces for newspapers?
We're already doing that.
Good. Because the more decentralized it is, the more congressional districts the initiative will be visible in.
Yes, sir. That's what we're doing. As we tape this, our staff in Washington is running around getting our members together, for quotations in newspapers, op-eds, Ledge the Editor, interviews with journalists, things like that.
Are you joining coalitions? For example, some of your positions are right on with the labor unions, with consumer groups, with civil rights groups, or are you mostly working by yourselves?
We do work with other people sometimes. Our positions do align sometimes. We are sometimes doing things by ourselves also. So it's, we're trying to use the unique position of our brand name, the Patriotic Millionaires. As I said, it's sort of headline news that millionaires are not in favor of gross inequality. So we try to use that instead of being the 1,000th group to come in and say, it's immoral that poor people are so poor, because lots of people know that that's immoral. But it's only the wealthy people who can say, actually, wealthy people do better too when there's less inequality and more fairness in our society. So that's why we try to put our sort of a different message around things that other groups are just not able to do.
What is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, led by Mr. Donahue's, response to you?
I would say the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is neither a chamber nor is for commerce. I would describe it more as a lobbying firm with a funny name, frankly. They are in favor of whatever the few largest donors that fund their organization want to do to typically make themselves more greedy.
Well, they're on the exact opposite side of you. They want to get rid of the estate tax. They want to freeze the minimum wage. So you have a point-counterpoint. They also have a nice public sidewalk. Their headquarters faces Lafayette Square and the White House. Barack Obama actually once in 2012 or so walked across Lafayette Square to pay homage to the Chamber of Commerce. He didn't get much in return for that move. But do you see yourself as Patriotic Millionaires confronting the Chamber of Commerce and peacefully demonstrating in front of that broad sidewalk?
We very well might. I don't know if that's on our schedule. I'm the chairman of the board. I don't speak for we make decisions. Our president makes tactical decisions, and our members decide for themselves whether or not to participate in each of our actions. But that's definitely something we could do. More likely, we will try to get them to do some public event with us, a debate or point-counterpoint or something.
Yeah, they're not known to engage in friendly public debates. But you raise an interesting point. How is the decision-making power in Patriotic Millionaires exercised? For example, suppose you wanted to come out against massive stock buybacks, which enrich the top executives of companies like Walmart or General Electric, but deprive the company itself of precious capital to invest either in productive plant and equipment, shoring up the pension funds, increasing the salaries or wages, or engaging in other productive activity. Let's say you supported that, or one of your multimillionaires did. What is the decision-making process?
Well, I'll tell you how our group works. We have hundreds of members. Quite a few of them signed up to be part of our policy committee. We have a meeting, typically by conference call, could be in person sometimes. And we try to get a consensus among our members. Typically, it's a long process of first having people explain things and then giving people time to think about them and then having a conference call later. And we're not going to do something based on, 11 in favor, 10 opposed, the motion passes. It has to be a broad consensus of our members before we take a position on a new issue. Mm-hmm. And indeed, we've not had a position on stock buybacks.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a position on what liberals call corporate welfare and what the conservatives call crony capitalism? That is, huge federal subsidies, handouts, giveaways, bailouts to big business, like the bailout of Wall Street.
Well, no, that's not something we've worked on, frankly. I think that my personal opinion is that the people who were in office at the time, this is during the George W. Bush administration, mm-hmm. They did what they believed to be right. And of course, their beliefs are tempered by their backgrounds and where they come from. So I don't, and we obviously are not in favor of more bailouts. What we're concerned about, we do a position on, is the efforts to get rid of the Dodd-Frank rules and sort of unregulate, again, large parts of the financial industry will lead to conditions which will require, further financial crises in the future. So we're very much in favor of keeping in place the regulations that were put in place back in 2010.
Well, that's going to be up for a challenge in Congress, so that's another opportunity for you to make your impact known. But let's talk about two issues that have been in the news. The Wisconsin state government has just enacted a law under Governor Walker to lure a Chinese company, Foxconn, to build a plant in Paul Ryan's district in southern Wisconsin with $3 billion of subsidies over a number of years. And now Amazon is dangling its second headquarters before a number of cities, basically saying bid. And the report indicates that Amazon wants about $7 to $8 billion of goodies and freebies. What about those?
Well, I don't speak for Amazon. I am very concerned about what they're planning to do in Wisconsin. I think it'd be far cheaper for the Wisconsin government to simply give the $3 billion to the roughly 13,000 people they're expecting Foxconn to hire, instead of sending it, they're planning to send almost $200 million a year to China.
It's and hundreds of thousands of dollars per job created if Foxconn comes through on his promise, which its record casts doubt on.
Yeah, it's not even just that they're going to reduce Foxconn's taxes. They're actually going to give Foxconn money, because the amount of the subsidy is far greater than the amount of taxes they charge, since they've reduced corporate taxes to almost zero for firms like that in Wisconsin already. So, I'm very concerned about the amount of money that the Wisconsin government is going to take from their actual taxpayers and send to the Chinese owners of Foxconn, that it will really be bad for most people in Wisconsin.
We're talking with Morris Pearl, a former BlackRock executive who retired 3.5 years ago after a long career on Wall Street to work and direct the Patriotic Millionaires full time. What has been the reaction from your former colleagues at BlackRock, which, by the way, manages trillions of dollars, is the biggest in the country? And second, have you had any luck luring Lawrence Fink, the head of BlackRock, to join Patriotic Millionaires?
Well, Mr. Fink has not joined Patriotic Millionaires, so that would be fine if he did. No one, well, maybe with one exception, no one has really spoken against this. A lot of people think it's great what we're doing. Most people who really think about it agree that we don't want sort of an oligarchy run by a few people who are extremely rich and have lots of poor people, kind of like what's going on in Russia now. On the specifics, there are a lot of people out there who just say, well, I know what you're right, but I don't want to pay any more taxes, and there are greedy people. Mm-hmm. And there are people who just don't like to pay taxes, regardless of fairness or equality or anything else.
Well, I read a report recently where overall the tax burden on Americans is lower than it's been in 60 years. I mean, it's hardly at its peak.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of corporations don't pay any income taxes for years, as you know. General Electric for years made billions of dollars of U.S.-based profits and didn't pay a cent and got a refund in a bizarre twist of the tax code. And so did Verizon, the telephone company. Boeing pays very little federal income taxes, gets huge subsidies. Why do you think Trump keeps getting away by saying that American corporations are taxed at the highest in the world, when if you net it down, it's really pretty modest?
Well, because people don't really know. And these huge corporations indeed pay almost no taxes. But all of your mom and pop companies on Main Street who actually employ more people than big corporations, they do pay 35% tax rates because they don't have any ability to shift their taxes overseas or hide their profits. So all of these small business people in small towns around America, they do see a much higher tax rate than the big companies see. And that's why people believe Mr. Trump. That's why, and what he's going to end up doing is reducing taxes just for the bigger companies. Instead of having the problem with money held overseas and then taxed when they repatriate, he's going to reduce the tax rate to zero on that money.
Well, what is Patriotic Millionaires, Mr. Perot, what is Patriotic Millionaires' position on what are called corporate inversions? That's where an American company chartered in the U.S., Delaware or elsewhere, melds in a company in Ireland or Luxembourg and then escapes U.S. taxes, even though it continues doing business and making profits in this country. Can you describe to our listeners what may be a confusing tax strategy?
It is confusing, yes. Basically, the general rule is that a U.S.-based company has to pay taxes on all of the money, all of the profits they make all over the world that are brought back into their company in the United States. Many companies avoid that by having affiliates in other countries that do not send the profits back to the United States, and they wait for the Republicans to declare some kind of a tax holiday, and then they send them all back then, like they did 10 years ago. And then companies based overseas, if it's not, say, a French company or an Irish company, if they have a subsidiary in the United States, that subsidiary only pays taxes on its own business, not on the business of the entire company overseas, all over the world. And so what they've done is some American companies, like in the pharmaceutical business, have merged with companies based in Ireland, which is a very low tax rate, even though it has half the population of New York City. And they said, oh, now we're a Ireland-based company that just happens to have some business in the U.S. We only pay U.S. taxes on our U.S. profits. And oh, by the way, they're nothing because we have all these expenses in Ireland that the U.S. company is being charged for. And we don't think that's right. We think that companies should not be able to just move money around the world and hide it in these lower tax jurisdictions. So we support a system where companies have to pay taxes on all of their profits and should not have the opportunity, which the bigger companies can take advantage of kind of just moving money around and saying, oh, all of our profits are in these low tax countries like Ireland or Luxembourg.
This is an amazing phenomena, listeners. We're hearing from Morris Pearl, who heads the Patriotic Millionaires organization, and he's talking ethically, he's talking historically, he's talking in terms of justice. The Patriotic Millionaires have produced a book, Mr. Pearl, I understand. Yes. It's called Renegotiating Power and Money in America, renegotiating power and money in America. And for our listeners who have discussions with right-wing corporatists who think corporations should dominate things in our country, they can get a lot of arguments from the Patriotic Millionaires by getting this book, Renegotiating Power and Money in America. And what is your website so they can keep up to date with what you're doing?
Yeah, take a look at our website, patrioticmillionaires.org. It's just patrioticmillionaires.org. And you can find the PDF file for our book on the website. And we'd love more people to get involved. Anyone who wants to can sign up and join.
Have you been much involved at the state and local level on comparative issues, and not just the congressional level?
We have. One of our issues we've been talking about is tax loopholes that only the very wealthiest get to take advantage of. For instance, the way that people who earn money, of particularly hedge fund managers, call it carried interest and say that they're not, they don't have to pay taxes at the normal income tax rates on that money. We think that's a ridiculous loophole, that these people who may indeed work very hard don't pay tax at the same rate that other people who work hard do. We've gotten nowhere in the U.S. Congress. A bill has been sponsored by Tammy Baldwin in the Senate and Sandy Levin in the House to close the loophole, but has not made much progress. So we've gone to some states, New York, Illinois, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and they are all working on an interstate compact, have a state income tax on just the money that these few very wealthy fund managers save from this federal tax loophole, and make that a state issue. So we've gone to those states. I've personally testified a couple of times in Hartford, Connecticut, in Providence, Rhode Island, in Albany, New York.
Well, Warren Buffett is on your side here, one of the richest people in America. He's come out against taxing carried interest as capital gains instead of regular income. And
almost everyone has who's thought about it.
Yes, and I must say that even Senator Grassley told me he thought that was not right, because he was at a hearing with Senator John Kerry, and Senator Chuck Schumer in the Senate, and he said to me, "What's with these Democrats? They came out protecting Wall Street here." Grassley, of course, is from Iowa, but Bill Gates and Warren Buffett started this pledge group of billionaires and multi-billionaires pledging to give away at least half of their wealth to good works while they're on Earth. And have you been in touch with them at all? I would think that on a number of issues, Buffett, Gates, and some of these pledge wealthy people would be on your side.
Yes, they're on our side. I mean, the very wealthiest people don't really need our group to help them, because they have their own political operation themselves they want, and they don't really need us to help them with their publicity, because they have plenty. One of our board members, Chuck Collins, was the founder of Wealth for the Common Goods and has worked with Mr. Gates. And we do have a lot of people, particularly speaking out about the estate tax, which is one of the more egregious issues.
What do you think the prospects are? Can the Democrats and a few Republicans stop this tax shenanigan legislation?
I think they'll stop some of it. I mean, I honestly don't know. I'm not I'm not a person who predicts what's going to happen in the future with the United States Congress. So, I mean, if they really want to, they'll do. I mean, if the Congress people agree on something, they'll do it.
What's interesting is
I honestly don't know.
That the Republicans are going to try to avoid the filibuster by the Democrats and to pass tax reform as part of their budget reconciliation procedure. I mean, this is quite absurd to put it under a budget reconciliation, but they're going to try to get away with it and get the Senate and House parliamentarians to support it. But if they don't, and then it'll take 60 votes in the Senate, and they're never going to get 60 votes to pass this. The word in Washington now is that the Republicans are running out of time this year, and they're never going to get to tax reform, as they call it.
I have a personal question, if you just have a second, just about how, in your story, what was it about you and your upbringing or your experience or you and your companion that landed you on this side of the issue as opposed to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce side?
I think maybe just having a slightly broader view of things,
More of a long-term thinker.
view. Yeah. I mean, I have kids. They're now both in their 20s. I have two sons who are both in their 20s. And I'm thinking not about, we need extra money because we want to go on vacation, some fancy vacation next year, but I'm kind of thinking about what life is going to be like when they have their kids and want to send their kids to school and stuff, and how people are going to make money and what kind of society we're going to have.
Right. And that's probably characteristic of a lot of your compatriots.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a matter of people who have a little bit of patience. I mean, if your thinking horizon is only like, this year and I want to make more money and have a fancier car or whatever, then maybe you do want lower tax and you don't really care about the long term. But
it seems to me that people on the other side would also, there's a basic distrust of government and how they would use tax money. And that the idea is, listen, if I keep my money, I will give it to the charities and the causes that I want, and I'll have more control that way. Do you think that's a part of it?
Yeah, but there's so many things that are not and cannot be done by charity. First of all, roughly half the federal budget goes to defense, which charity doesn't do, which is good. And secondly, a lot of things cannot be done by charity. Sure, you can get David Rubenstein to pay for like refurbishing the Washington Monument because he thinks that's cool, or something fancy in the Smithsonian Museum. But you're not going to get somebody to pay for water treatment plants or for clean water in Flint, Michigan by a charity. You're not going to get people to, repair stretches of I-95 going through Florida that have been washed out by the hurricane. Those are things that it's hard to get people excited about. Oh, I want to have, the art museum named after me. Very few people want to have a stretch of I-95 through Hollywood named after them.
Right.
But,
is your book, Renegotiating Power and Money in America, online as well as in bookstores?
You can download a copy of our book from the website.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Morris Pearl, for explaining this extraordinary organization, Patriotic Millionaires, and the positions that they're taking as a counterpoint to some of the oligarchic-minded U.S. Chamber of Commerce and their associates who are swarming over Congress. So we look forward to a lot of news about Patriotic Millionaire in the corridors of Congress and the congressional hearings on the upcoming tax legislation. Thank you.
Good. Great to be on your show, Ralph. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking to Morris Pearl, chair of Patriotic Millionaires. We will link to the Patriotic Millionaires at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Monday, September 25, 2017. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Gatorade has been banned from insulting its main competitor, water, and fined $300,000 after it slandered Nature's sports drink in a video game. California Attorney General Xavier Becerra sued the neon-colored beverage company over its cell phone game Bolt, in which players guide track star Usain Bolt around to collect coins and bottles of Gatorade, but must avoid water, which slows the Olympian down. Gatorade portrayed its products positively while inaccurately and negatively depicting water as hindering athletic performance, Becerra's office said in a statement. Making misleading statements is a violation of California law, he said. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. A few weeks ago, we talked to The Nation magazine's John Nichols, author of Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse. We talked about how easy it is to be distracted by the soap opera and palace intrigue going on in the White House, while a lot of bad stuff is happening in the governmental agencies that are headed by a rogues gallery of corporate shills intent on dismantling the very agencies they lead. So this week, we're going to talk to someone who once headed in an important agency and proved to be a true model for the effective public servant. David?
Michael Pertschuk is a former chair of the Federal Trade Commission under President Jimmy Carter. As a Senate staffer in the 60s and 70s, Mr. Pertschuk was instrumental in drafting the landmark legislation requiring cigarette warning labels and banning cigarette advertising on television. He is the co-founder of the Advocacy Institute, which offers a range of legislative counseling and services to citizens to help them advocate for their issues. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Welcome indeed, Mike Pertschuk. I must tell our listeners that we were very close collaborators, me on the outside and Mike in the Senate, to launch a good part of the consumer movement in this country, including the auto safety and highway safety laws of 1966 that went through under Senator Warren Magnuson, the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, for whom Mike Pertschuk worked. Mike, your book is called When the Senate Worked for Us. And I want to get my listeners to write to their senators and representatives and say, there's a book out that says, When the Senate Worked for Us back in the 60s and 70s. Why isn't the Senate working for us now? And I think that will get the attention of some members of Congress. Explain what you mean when you say, when the Senate worked for us.
Well, there are many aspects to this, Ralph. In fact, in a way, it was difficult deciding just exactly what the book was showing. But among its primary goals, and it's a book full of stories of what staff people who were working there, working in the Senate and between the 1960s and 1970s. It was an enormously productive time. I think if I could boast on behalf of the committee and Senator Magnuson and the staff, we produced more public interest and public health laws, good ones, strong ones, than had ever been recorded in the history of the Senate. But all the way through what I write about the stories, or I use stories from my colleagues who worked for different Magnuson and other good progressive senators, serious senators, what comes through is our relationships, working relationships with Republicans, working relationship with very conservative Democrats from the South, and how we treated each other and how they treated each other. There was respect. There was comedy. The conservatives would come up with a problem on a bill. We would sit down and talk together. And many of the Republicans, and this is really something which has to be understood, in those years, the Democrats had strong majorities after Lyndon Johnson election. But the Republicans, half of the Republicans, were perfectly comfortable being known as liberal Republicans. And many of them worked very closely with their Democratic colleagues to pursue progressive legislation and legislation that was needed. There was none of the nastiness that takes place now, none of the ridiculous failure to face up to serious needs for regulatory regulation.
Well, you made a big point in the book on the importance of professional staff to these senators, whereas now a lot of the staff comes from K Street lobbyists who farm out their associates to serve senators and representatives, mostly in the Republican Party, and then go back to their K Street lobbying jobs at higher salaries. So it's like two different worlds. And I want you to discuss something that is a corollary to a professional staff, which is you opened up the hearings to experts from all over the country who would never be invited to congressional hearing. And one of the hearings you had was to toughen the flammable fabrics law, which was too weak. And you invited a physician from Washington State. Can you explain that process?
Yes. First of all, Senator Magnuson was a broad and an open-minded senator. And he wasn't an angel. He had his limits. But he believed that hearings and that the role of staff in making sure that the hearings presented at least a balanced version of the issues at stake. And then we were assigned to create the hearings, to sharpen the hearings, to make them work, and to get the right people. We went out and reached for them. When I was a staff person on that committee, I would say to younger staff people, look, you have to listen to the lobbyists. They may have something to tell you that's serious, but you have a greater responsibility. And that is many of the people who understood these issues, many of them who felt strongly about them, many of them who were scientists, could not come to Washington and into your office and lobby on the other side. You had to find the people who worked as consumers and public interest advocates, either in nonprofit organizations or in universities or elsewhere, and scientists who really understood what the dangers were and what the cures were. And this was our way of working. We wanted to make sure that the voices of those who didn't have a huge lobby behind them, didn't have a lot of money, weren't publicly known, would be able to speak, and the committee would be able to listen.
Well, one thing listeners should know is that Michael Pertschuk was the grand strategist toward the tobacco industry. When he came to the Senate and when I came to Washington, the tobacco industry was viewed as all-powerful. Not only had it addicted a lot of people, but it had addicted a lot of members of Congress to obeying the dictates of the tobacco industry, which was no counter-advertising, no regulation of the ingredients in the tobacco, no nothing. Just let this giant nicotine addiction spread throughout the country. And at that time, 45% of adults were regular daily smokers. It's now about 15 or 16%. Tremendous progress. But it was Mike Pertschuk who helped galvanize the Senate Commerce Committee, the Congress, later as the Federal Trade Commission chair, after he left government as a citizen leader internationally, working with anti-smoking advocates in countries around the world. And given his personality, he's never taken much credit for this, and I don't expect him to embellish what I'm saying, but it's true that without you, Mike, the battle against tobacco would have taken a lot longer, including non-smoking sections in transportation vehicles and now almost any public institution, restaurants, hospital waiting rooms, no smoking, no smoking. Tell us what the preliminary response of the tobacco lobbyists were when you started this effort in the U.S. Senate.
Well, first I want to thank you, but also point out that, yes, I worked on tobacco control, and I had an opportunity to do so on the committee. But in fact, when I first came to work as a young staff member, I didn't know anything about tobacco. I didn't know anything about what was going on. There was a report from London by British scientists that first brought to light the dangers of tobacco control. And just as I was talking about before, I reached out because when you called from the Senate, people answered the phone. And what I searched for was those scientists at the public health organizations, those scientists for the Cancer Society and the Heart Association and others who worked on this, nonprofit groups who worked on this, and they educated me. And not only did they educate me, but some of them pushed me, and some of them pushed me hard, which was a good thing. And of course, the lobbyists came to see me. The lobbyists tried to be friendly. They tried to convince me that either that, well, we were going too far, there was the science wasn't good, or they threatened to go and talk to the senators if we were pig-headed. Well, our senators, especially our chairman, wasn't listening to them. But you have to see this as a process between those who are what I call outside and inside, who are all advocates. We were advocates. There was no, and that is by we, I mean the staff members that worked for Magnuson. We were loyal to Magnuson. He was a strong consumer advocate and protector himself, and we wanted to serve him well. But at the same time, we wanted to serve the public interest well. And we developed an informal coalition between the outside groups and advocacy groups. And please let me say that the first outside of the Senate advocate that I really encountered when I was just 3 or 4 months a member of the staff member was a fellow named Ralph Nader. And I have to tell you that when he came to talk to me and tell me what was going on in the auto safety industry and how much it needed regulation, I listened to him and I said to myself, you know what? I think you're dead right, but there isn't a way in hell that the Senate Commerce Committee, which gets all sorts of money from everywhere, would challenge the most powerful lobby in the United States, which was Detroit, the auto companies. And Ralph will tell you that he went away somewhat disillusioned, but he kept at it. And it wasn't just Ralph. He taught me a great deal. And alongside Ralph were many of public interest advocates who had been devoting their lives to different issues. And going back to it, there were those who really devoted their lives to public health and to anti-smoking. One of the great resources for us that I learned, was that at the top of many of the agencies, many of the secretariats, were still politicians who didn't want to do anything. But deep in the heart of many of these agencies, many of the agencies, especially those dealing with health, of course, there were people who were passionate, knowledgeable about the dangers of smoking, sophisticated about the way in which it should be dealt with. And I reached out to them, and then they reached out for me. So the process that was so different in this Congress, in these two Congresses from the 60s and 70s, was the collaboration between the staff members who at least had a good sense of what needed to be done, with those from the outside who could teach them, and that was our greatest gift.
Well, what was so impressive is how open you all were to people around the country who had the goods on a lot of these companies and wanted corrective safety legislation. For example, there was a physician, Abraham Bergman, in Seattle. He was a pediatrician, and he'd seen a lot of kids burned by flammable fabrics, and he contacted Senator Magnuson, who was his senator, and generated thousands of letters demanding legislation to ban flammable children's wear. That doesn't happen today. It's very hard even to have congressional hearings. The Republicans go right to the floor. They don't observe regular order. And when they do have hearings, ordinary citizens who know what they're talking about and have started efforts back home are not invited. So that's one of the reasons why the Senate is not working for us now, because they don't let us in on their deliberative procedures and their hearings, or even just meeting with the members is very, very difficult now, unless you're a major contributor. One of the bills that was passed was the Consumer Product Safety Bill that established the Consumer Product Safety Commission. A lot of household products were hazardous, and many still are, but the situation has improved. You also, your committee, Mike, Senator Maggs' committee worked hard on labeling. That's labeling, food labeling, children's aspirin labeling, which saved lives. That children shouldn't take aspirin at a certain time of their early lives. And then suddenly it was over. In 1980, the Reagan landslide of Jimmy Carter took with them Senator Magnuson, Senator Nelson, Senator Church, a lot of the great senators who made us remember the Senate as standing for the right things on behalf of the people. And that's when you went over to the Federal Trade Commission. Do you want to describe the nightmare that descended on you when you became chair of the Federal Trade Commission?
Yes. The book you have now, When the Senate Worked for Us, was a great pleasure to write, because the senators were great. The staff members were given a lot of room. We had the opportunity to fight the lobbyists. And most of the book is the story of, not my own stories, but the stories of my colleagues and friends who worked on Magnuson's committee and with the other senators. And the one question I asked was, asking the staff members and my friends, the colleagues, what was the best story you have about overcoming the power of the corporate lobbyists and beating them in a way that came out of the committee, the strong legislation that was needed. And of course, as you talk about what happened since, when the Republicans took over the Senate and House in 2010, during the 2010 elections, the New York Times reported that the new controllers of the chairman of the committees reached out and hired 100 lobbyists directly from the lobby's offices as the staff members of those committees. That eliminated committed staff, entrepreneurial staff, those that were holding the line for the truth. They disappeared. It destroyed the existence of staff, and as a matter of fact, of members who had been paid off as barriers to just what the lobbyists wanted. I have some faith. And I end the book by saying, and looking at the reactions against what's happening in the Congress now, and of course in the White House, the word Trump does not appear in the book. It appears elsewhere enough. But what I do say is that I have reason to believe, I call it a rational leap of faith, that in the next election, in 18, and especially in the next presidential election, there is a rational leap of faith that much of what was good in the 60s and 70s can return.
Well, you talk about the bumblebees, and you say we need a new generation of bumblebees. Who are the bumblebees in the book?
Well, I had started to put it in the title of the book, but my publisher wouldn't let me because he said, who are the bumblebees? And there's a story behind it, which is that when Nixon was president, he paid lip service to consumer protection and public health and said he was going to support it. But he managed, because he was so close to the corporate lobbyists, to offer the weakest of laws to the Senate, to the Congress. Fortunately, Magnuson and we were prepared. And the bills that came out were nothing like what the president had wanted, what Nixon had wanted. They were strong. And Nixon was so frustrated that his staff member, John Ehrlichman, was the closest to the president. And he was so frustrated in the strong bills that came back that the president was forced to sign by public pressure. And he said, these senators and congressmen, they're not so crazy, but it's these staff people who hover around the honey of power like bumblebees. Well, first of all, bumblebees don't like honey. But secondly, we took this as the staff members as a prize, acknowledging that we have had an effect. And it made us proud. And then now this almost 40 years ago, all of the people after we left our roles in the Senate, our staff work, and many of us, and I must say most of us did not go on to being lobbyists. Most of them went back to practicing law or to doing public interest work, and it was not their ambition when they worked for the committee to create a record which would help them get a good lobbying position. Very few of them did that. And so we called ourselves the bumblebees, Magnuson's bumblebees. And every 2 or 3 years, we meet. And we meet together, and we tell stories, and we cherish the memories we had in this amazing opportunity, which we thought would go on forever, but hasn't.
Well, on that note, we want to suggest to our listeners that you start generating some sparks so it can happen again. And an easy one for you is to write your 2 senators and say, have you read this book, When the Senate Worked for Us, by Michael Pertschuk in the 1960s and 1970s, and why isn't the Senate working for us now? That'll make them think a bit, and you might get some interesting responses in the mail or by email. When Mike was chairman of the Federal Trade Commission between 1977 through 1980 until Reagan got elected, he didn't have bumblebees in the Senate or the House, and they were on his back all the time trying to stop his moves to limit some of the violent, corrosive, deceptive children's advertising that was swarming over millions of our children on television and on these children's shows. And so he had a harder time as chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, although he certainly brought that once sleepy commission up to a higher level of activity.
What you've asked for is really important. And I've started working on another book about the terrible experiences I had at the FTC. And the working title I've got for this new book is There's No Such Thing as an Independent Regulatory Agency. And what I meant for that is the Federal Trade Commission had powers under the law to go after all kinds of antitrust and consumer exploitation, but it couldn't do so without a national political support system, without people in their own communities who were watching over their congressmen and their senators. And of course, the senators themselves. The importance of electing those who will not cave in to the lobbyists and not give way to the lobbyists. And I have to say that when the lobbyists went after the Trade Commission, Ralph will probably remember, but they were so powerful. And it's the Democrats as well as the Republicans. They were so powerful that when the House passed a continuing resolution bill to fund all agencies, they left the FTC out, so that we were legally required to pack up and close down the Federal Trade Commission until President Carter stepped in and saved the commission.
Thank you very much, Michael Pertschuk. This is a wonderful book.
Thank you.
That's our show. We want to thank our guests, Morris Pearl, head of Patriotic Millionaires, and Michael Pertschuk, author of When the Senate Worked for Us, The Invisible Role of Staff When Countering Corporate Lobbyists. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up. For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. And if you're interested in visiting the American Museum of Tort Law, please go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky. Our theme music is Stand Up, Rise Up, and it was written by and performed by Kemp Harris. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Jimmy, Steve, David. When the Senate worked for us, write your senator and say, why doesn't it work for us now? You'll get them stimulated at the least. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We gotta stand up. Oh, you've been sitting way too long.
This is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour with the Wrap-Up. We have a few things on the list, including some extended conversation with Ralph and Patriotic Millionaire Morris Pearl, David talking a little bit more about bumblebees and cigarette advertising. But first we want to get to a segment that Steve introduced in the beginning of the show where Ralph weighs in on Donald Trump versus the NFL.
This week, Donald Trump declared war on the NFL when he should be paying attention to what's going on in Puerto Rico.
That's just the point, isn't it? Another distraction strategy by Donald Trump. He has ignored Puerto Rico, although he's now going down because of the uproar. This is the most devastating hurricane ever to hit Puerto Rico since 1898, when a hurricane flattened the whole island. The island is without electrical power. They don't think they're going to get it back within 4 to 6 months. Imagine 3.5 million people in the dark. 3.5 million people without refrigeration, without air conditioning, without food supplies, without the kind of help that has been streaming to Texas and Florida, even though that is grossly incomplete. I think the time for a decision is coming for Donald Trump. He can't cheerlead his way through this. He's going to have to get a $250 billion appropriation from Congress for Texas, Florida, Georgia, Puerto Rico, and other hard-hit areas. And the Congress has only passed a $15 billion bill that he's signed. So he's going to have to face the moment of truth.
And the NFL uniting, is he actually doing a favor to African Americans in this country?
Well, no, it's his so-called appealing to his base, which supports probably what he said about NFL players and the national anthem and the flag. But if you look at it historically, You know, I grew up when the NFL had not a single black player. Baseball had not a single black player. And now we have national television showing us black and white players locking arms, taking a knee, and nuzzling the smaller white CEO who owns the team. So I guess that's a kind of progress in a way, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. That's what I meant. That you really do have to discuss unarmed black men being shot by cops now. That's the issue.
That's the substantive issue that's motivating these players to do what they're doing, because they really have no other outlet. I mean, they can't have press conferences. That gets them into very, very dubious territory in terms of the press, public opinion, and so they're doing their part. It's a silent, nonviolent gesture to remind us that the Pledge of Allegiance ends with the phrase, with liberty and justice for all. And what these players are saying is that is a lie. And they're paying attention to it by putting their knee down or not showing up at the time of the national anthem, staying in the clubhouse, etc.
And the president's attitude seems like such a plantation mindset, where he was deriding them for worrying about concussions and the game's not violent enough. And, hey, stand up or you're fired. If anybody thinks he is for workers, this has got to tell you very starkly that this guy is an owner. He's a plantation owner.
Well, even worse, the little noted subtext is when he criticized efforts to reduce the concussion impact of football, for preteens, for teenagers, for high school, for college. And he was appealing in Alabama, to the Alabama football team. They want to hit, he said. Well, is he ignoring massive evidence of brain damage later in life? And all these NFL players who have died, and the autopsies show overwhelming number of them had very serious brain damage, and it impaired their lives during their 40s and 50s and 60s. This is a callous and cruel presidential burst, just another one by Trump, who doesn't want to release either his tax returns or his medical records. He has not released anything about his medical records since a year ago when he dribbled out a few things with a cheerleading physician. Very, very incomplete. I think that's the next challenge that's going to be put to Donald Trump. Do what all other presidents have done. Full release of your medical records now.
And now here's Ralph and Morris Pearl.
I have a column in USA Today, today's edition, about Equifax, for instance, saying that we're trying to use a tagline, defending the Seventh Amendment. The Seventh Amendment is the one that says trial by jury, and we're taking position against all these mandatory arbitration clauses.
Oh, very good. You're taking a stand on that?
Yeah, we're against mandatory arbitration clauses.
Excellent. Yeah, that blocks the courtroom door to millions of people.
Yeah, we're thinking of trying to start a campaign defending the Seventh Amendment, sort of as a slight riff on all the Second Amendment people.
Oh, well, you'll have our full support for that. We opened the American Museum of Tort Law in Connecticut. And if you go to tortmuseum.org, you'll see how central the Seventh Amendment is to that museum. The only law museum in the world, by the way, of any kind.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'll send our guys there. Our staff people are at 17th and K. We've got 10 people in Washington.
And now here's David talking about bumblebees and cigarette advertising.
Ralph, I remember during the height of the space age that experts in aerodynamics insisted that the bumblebee couldn't fly, that they try to figure out the thrust, the weight, and the drag on a bumblebee. And they said, scientifically, it's impossible for a bumblebee to fly, and yet it does. Have you ever heard?
Legislatively, the bumblebee flew again and again in the 60s and 70s on Capitol Hill.
No. That wasn't what we said. We said, yes, that Ehrlichman was wrong. The bumblebees do not go after honey, but the bumblebees can sting. And that was what motivated us to move on.
In fact, in Mike Pertschuk's book, When the Senate Worked for Us, he has a page where there's one quote by Muhammad Ali. Quote, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee," end quote. Thank you for stinging these corporate lobbyists for a number of years on behalf of the American people. You, your colleagues, and the senators who you educated and motivated to do the right thing on our behalf.
Thank you.
Can you imagine now if they discovered that cigarettes cause cancer, the idea that you could ban advertising now? Possible.
Yeah. Mike?
Yes.
Tell me, was there an actual ban on cigarette advertising legislated in the Congress, or they just saw the heat and did it voluntarily on TV?
It's a complicated story because the Federal Communications Commission essentially was using what was then called the Fairness Doctrine. And because of a very, very strong staff person at the Federal Communications Commission, convinced the commissioners to treat cigarette advertising as a controversial issue and decreed that the cigarette companies, that for every 3 cigarette ads, the American Cancer Society and others would be able to put on all television free anti-smoking ads. And some of them were done, they were powerful.
So they pulled out of TV ads, yeah.
And so the industries were so upset and angry that they agreed to get out of television.
Yep. John Benz.
On the other hand, they also promised that they wouldn't increase printed advertising, which was a lie. They continue to use cigarette advertising, and they still do it.
I have a quick question, if you don't mind. I'm reading Jane Mayer's book about dark money, and she says that guys like Glenn Beck are getting $1 million a year to sneak talking points from the Koch brothers into their radio rants. If you guys had found out about that in the 60s and the 70s, would that have been legal back in the 60s and the 70s for somebody on the radio to just parrot talking points without saying they're coming from oil lobbyists?
I don't know legally whether that would be a crime or a misdemeanor.
Yeah, I don't think you can take money in return for doing what the donor wants. I think that's still a violation of the FCC rule. But if they do it in the guise of advertising, they get around it. The line between bribery and advertising is rather blurred.
It payola back in the 50s. It sounds like payola, but instead of music.
Yeah, that was pay to play. Yeah, that was illegal. Yeah.
And yes, in fact, one way of looking at this is we're the only country in the world in which corruption, the corrupt payment of money, is legal, because they don't have to hide it. They have unlimited ability to make contributions in various ways, and the Supreme Court has made it easier and easier for them to do that without having to break the law. That's another thing we need, of course, is a new change in the Supreme Court.